Story 1. Pancreatic cancer required a 10-hour surgery known as a Whipple procedure. It was very traumatic, and the experience still haunts me to this day. The surgery took place in 2021, and I am still clear of cancer. Story 2. Swine flu made me feel like my bones were made of glass, and I had to focus all of my energy on each breath. 500 kids were at school, and only 72 were able to show up one day. It is incredible that this happened before COVID-19. Story 3. I had a severe case of lupus and autoimmune disease years ago. At my diagnosis, I had the highest non-drug-induced antinuclear antibody level ever recorded. I took prednisone and chemotherapy to manage my immune system. This treatment came with terrible arthritis, inflammation, and fluid around my left lung, which required me to sleep upright, as well as kidney issues, mouth sores, esophagitis, and a host of other symptoms. It would have been fatal if it weren't for an experimental gene therapy that turned off the disease. Story 4. Food poisoning is a serious condition, not just an upset stomach. It can cause 24 hours of pure pain that affects you deeply. Symptoms may include severe gastrointestinal distress. Story 5. I was going to talk about how sick I felt from a particularly bad case of strep throat, but then I read the comments. Story 6. Clostridium difficile infection after taking amoxicillin for an ear infection resulted in continuous diarrhea, occurring 30 to 40 times a day for nearly a month before it was brought under control. I lost 40 pounds. Story 7. I have been disabled since birth. Additionally, I have an inflamed gallbladder, which causes significant pain. Story 8. Collagenous colitis, which caused frequent bowel movements, led to the detection of early-stage breast cancer in November 2020. I am doing well now and truly believe that colitis saved my life. Story 9. COVID in March 2020 was like having a cold. I thought I had recovered after a week or two, but when I tried to go on my usual daily 5-kilometer walk, I collapsed. 5 years later, I still have long COVID and have never walked 5 kilometers again. Story 10. I consider myself lucky in this regard. The worst illness I experienced was a bad flu that made me feel as if I was about to die. I know people have had it much worse, and I hope for the best for everyone. Story 11. I felt disgusting and worried I was somehow infecting everyone around me just by existing, even though I was incredibly careful. I couldn't relax and was afraid to sleep, and I couldn't even consider leaving the house or walking around outside. It was the worst at night. I'd be up all night in the bathroom. It got to the point where I brought in a chair and a spare pillow to rest on the back of it so I could sleep while sitting on the toilet. The smell made me nauseous, and it felt like my insides were burning. I needed 3 rounds of antibiotics to clear it. Story 12. Food poisoning made me sweat, feel cold, vomit, shake, and experience explosive diarrhea for 3 days. I lost 10 pounds during that time. Story 13. I checked myself into the hospital on New Year's Day with a severe case of the flu and pneumonia. The last thing I remember is the doctor reviewing my chart in the hallway, visibly saddened, shaking his head and informing his colleagues that I might not make it through the night. I woke up the next day feeling much better and have not smoked again. Story 14. Severe dengue was honestly hell to live through. I remember how every morning they had to take a blood sample, and I have a strong fear of needles. I underwent a blood transfusion and never had an appetite to eat anything. I don't know if it was just a mental issue that prevented me from eating, but I felt weak for about 9 to 11 days. Story 15. I had an infection inside a surgical incision on my scalp that would not stay closed. I had to work with a specialized wound care team for months. There is nothing quite like the feeling of packing material tucked inside the incision, only to have it pulled out every 2 to 3 days and then restuffed. It is a deeply unpleasant experience. Story 16. Aortic dissection, type Stanford. It was urgent, and I thank the surgeon that I am still alive. It happened in 2018. Now, I just take my medicine and try not to have much stress, which is not an easy task. Story 17. COVID was extremely challenging. I have never felt that exhausted in my life. I couldn't even find the energy to turn around and pick up my phone when it rang. I remember being on my computer and barely having the strength to keep my head up, or even browse the internet. It makes me feel terrible for those who ended up with long COVID and experienced that level of exhaustion permanently. I can understand why some may feel suicidal at times. It is not the same as simply being tired enough to sleep. You can't fall asleep, and you are also too weary to do or enjoy anything. Every moment of being awake just feels like pain. I have had the flu in the past that was worse in terms of coughing and pain, but COVID was the worst in terms of completely disabling my ability to do anything. Story 18. I imagine cancer is not what you are asking about, so it is definitely related to COVID-19. I am not certain about this, and I am not patient zero or anything, but I live in New York City, and in late January 2020, I was the sickest I have ever been with cold or flu symptoms. My wife felt so ill that we took her to the emergency room. I am fairly confident that was COVID-19. Story 19. I had a ruptured appendix and surgery that caused pneumonia, peritonitis, ileus, and several abscesses in my abdomen and pelvis, requiring drains that I had to keep for a month. Story 20. A sinus infection that progressed and caused swelling was detected about 12 hours before it developed into meningitis. Story 21. Liver failure was significant. I had 33 liters of fluid in my abdomen for almost a year, along with malnutrition, constant vomiting, and uncontrollable itching that didn't stop when scratched. I experienced many challenges. Then, when I began to improve, my teeth started to crumble. I am mostly healthy now, but am still dealing with the lingering effects. Story 22. Three-way tie between gastroparesis, chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia. There are more intense acute illnesses, but anything that drags on can really destroy your life, even if the day-to-day symptoms don't seem so bad. Story 23. My wife developed Stevens-Johnson's syndrome. She was given an anticonvulsant, which caused her mucous membranes and skin to separate. It appeared as a horrific condition. She was treated as a third-degree burn patient in the burn ward, and few doctors had encountered this condition at the time. After 20 years, there are no scars on her body, but she cannot produce tears and has ongoing eye issues. Story 24. I am a parent of a son with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and anxiety. I am also a mother to another son who suffers from high-functioning autism and obsessive-compulsive disorder. Additionally, I suffer from lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, and chronic migraines. Story 25. I had a severe case of gastroenteritis. It was so bad that I lost 30 pounds in 10 days with constant vomiting and diarrhea, and I was feverish the entire time. Story 26. A mild stroke after a car accident caused me to lose my speech for a few months, but I was wrongly diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Because of that, I did not receive proper treatment. I am getting better, but it took me years. I am so glad I did not give up and continued searching for answers myself. Story 27. It was more of an annoyance because I was stuck in bed for 2 weeks. The only positive aspect was that I was miserable enough to not experience nicotine withdrawals. I should have kicked the habit then and there, but about a month later, I picked one up and have been smoking since. Story 28. Scoliosis is not an illness, but it was extremely challenging and severely limited my activities. Fortunately, I underwent spinal fusion surgery and have fully recovered. Story 29. Idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura required 3 weeks in the hospital and eventually resulted in my spleen being removed, which is no longer the treatment plan for the disease. Story 30. Cancer, age 19 to 20. I had to leave college for 9 months of chemotherapy, 6 weeks of radiation, and surgery to remove the tumor from my face. I had never experienced a serious health issue before that, with no broken bones or anything similar. Just a bump that appeared while shaving one morning. Story 31. I don't know the name, but my intestines felt like they were stuck in a knot. An actual knot or twist blocked my digestive system. I could not walk or talk. All I could do was scream and roll on the floor. I had to walk upright because rolling on the floor made it worse. However, the pain was too much, and in my distress, I accidentally gave my boyfriend a black eye and kicked my mom, only to roll on the floor in pain. Somehow, they got me to a doctor and I received a strong painkiller injection. I fell asleep for hours after that. The condition is called colic. Story 32. Well, my liver failed and almost killed me. I have severe alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. Liver transplants are basically miracles. Story 33. An illness in which doctors could not determine the cause turned out to be black magic. Thankfully, I recovered from it. Story 34. Anxiety is overwhelming. It does not even compare to my physical pain from scoliosis and endometriosis, which I can handle. Emotional pain is horrendous. Story 35. Acute alcoholic hepatitis took over a year for me to recover from. The good news is that I have been sober for 2 years now. Story 36. My mental illness is the only condition that has brought me to the brink of harming myself and wishing for death. Story 37. Several years ago, I loaded a bunch of camping gear onto my bicycle and spent the better part of the next 7 months riding 5,300 miles around the western United States solo. At night, I often preferred to wild camp. Rather than paying to sleep on the ground in a proper campground, I would simply find somewhere to disappear into the woods, a place where people were unlikely to find me and less likely to care that I was there. One night, while alone in the woods, I started coming down with food poisoning. I spent the whole night tossing and turning and leaning out the door of the tent to be sick. The next morning, I fixed a flat tire before riding for half a day through cold rain to a motel for some proper rest. I managed to outrun the illness for a few days, but eventually it caught back up to me when I was at a museum after making it to a larger city. I spent a rest day in the hostel recovering. In hindsight, I'm just thankful the illness waited until I was back in civilization. Strictly based on symptoms, COVID-19 was probably the most miserable illness I've ever had. However, the circumstances of my food poisoning, being alone in the woods with nothing but a bicycle to get me anywhere, made it genuinely one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Story 38. Mycoplasma encephalitis when I was 5. I spent 4 hours in a coma and 6 weeks in the hospital. I still have side effects more than 30 years later. Story 39. As a nurse, I have to say these comments are making me feel quite emotional. Some of the experiences you have all faced are intense. The worst illness I have experienced was fungal pneumonia as a smoker. The worst illness I didn't feel was exertional rhabdomyolysis. I walked into the clinic and said, "Hey, I have rhabdomyolysis." But the nurse practitioner replied, "No offense, but if you had rhabdomyolysis, you wouldn't be able to walk in here. Most of my patients with this condition are in the intensive care unit." I figured just for fun, let's draw some labs. About 30 minutes later, they were calling my emergency contact because I keep my phone permanently on Do Not Disturb, and they couldn't reach me. Although not technically an illness, I had my tonsils removed at 27, which is when I discovered I was allergic to my painkiller and experienced heightened sensitivity to pain. Head pain is already bad, but this was on another level. It hurt to breathe. I lost 21 pounds in 9 days and nearly ended up hospitalized because I could barely eat or drink. I was still bleeding on day 9, but within 3 days of a medication change, I was pain-free and mostly healed. I would rather endure extreme measures than go through that again. For context, I have a high sensitivity to pain. I've broken about 7 bones, have participated in combat sports, and suffer from chronic nerve damage. I know pain, but that heightened sensitivity, I wouldn't wish that on my worst enemy. Story 40. Hand, foot, and mouth disease is primarily found in children, but I contracted it as an adult and was ill for over a month. I had blisters in my mouth and a rash all over my face, hands, and mouth that felt like my skin was on fire and itched intensely. It also affected my kidneys. There is no cure or medication for it, so I just had to wait for it to resolve on its own. Story 41. Besides my mental health, I had cellulitis, a skin infection on my leg, which led to septic shock. I almost died. Story 42. Bowel perforation from diverticulitis caused the worst pain I have ever felt in my life. I had peritonitis and needed a colectomy. Thankfully, I am alive, but I am missing approximately a foot of my colon. Story 43. I was deeply involved in cocaine addiction 2 years ago. I nearly died twice within 3 weeks from overdose, lack of sleep, and poor nutrition. I made many terrible choices during my addiction and traumatized my loved ones when they had to pick me up off the bathroom floor during an overdose. Then I experienced a grand mal seizure 3 weeks later. The impact of my head hitting the floor during the seizure caused a concussion, chipped many of my teeth, and even loosened some of my bottom teeth. Fortunately, I was able to keep all of my teeth. I relapsed months later but put an end to my substance use 15 months and 2 days ago. Recovery is possible, and I feel blessed every day to be making healthy choices. Story 44. I was once very depressed in high school and college, to the point where I had no appetite and wanted to be free from my struggles. It's difficult to express just how bad it was, but the last time I felt that low was 10 years ago, and I am grateful I do not remember the depths of that despair anymore. Having your mind working against you every day is an exhausting experience. I currently deal with memory loss and many other issues as a result. Story 45. I received my second COVID-19 shot and my first shingles vaccine on the same day to avoid an extra trip to the health department. The following 3 days were the most miserable I have ever experienced. Story 46. I have multiple endocrine neoplasia type 1 syndrome. The 3 phases are 1. Parathyroids. Overactive parathyroids causing calcium buildup in the kidneys. 35 stones removed. 2. By major surgery. A major parathyroid operation was performed to remove swollen glands. Pituitary gland. A benign tumor was operated on through the sinus cavity. I was given 3 months to live at age 31. Pancreas gland. Overactive, leading to diabetes. I have suffered from major depression after the parathyroid operation since age 30. Life is a real struggle at 70, but I am still alive and kicking. Story 47. Either an obstructed kidney stone or Helicobacter pylori infection. One caused the worst pain I have ever felt, while the other resulted in nonstop vomiting and diarrhea for 5 days, followed by taking 4 antibiotics at once, which upset my stomach for weeks. Story 48. It's probably a 3-way tie. Shingles, gallstones, and a respiratory infection that I recently overcame. The shingles were the second youngest case my doctor had ever seen. The gallstones required 2 procedures and an ambulance ride to the nearest larger hospital because my liver enzymes were 10 times the normal range. Initially, I felt completely fine until I started coughing. I would cough so hard that I fell out of my chair and didn't leave my bed for 3 days straight. I coughed for 26 days in total. By day 10, they prescribed me 2 antibiotics and a steroid, which finally resolved the cough after I developed pneumonia. I tested negative for every possible illness, and between days 3 and 10, I developed a wheeze so severe that my doctor couldn't believe I was still upright. It was probably the sickest I've ever been. Story 49. The disease in my nervous system is often not believed to exist by most people, or they think I do not have it because of my age. Fibromyalgia. Story 50. Norovirus was miserable. It was the only time in my adult life that I vomited from anything other than binge drinking. Story 51. Ulcerative colitis is not curable. Last year, I nearly bled to death from severe blood loss over several months before going to the hospital, where I required blood transfusions. I would not choose to go through that experience again. Story 52. I had a small bowel obstruction that required a nasal gastric tube inserted through my deviated septum, which resulted in chronic nosebleeds for 2 days. I experienced choking and gagging on the tube and was unable to eat or drink during that time. A dye was administered through the tube to open the obstruction, which led to immediate, painful, and uncontrollable diarrhea. Story 53. My wife had amoebic dysentery, and to make matters worse, she contracted it in a developing country. This was one of our first experiences with hospitals and emergency rooms in the developing world. It seems kind of exciting now that we know we can survive through it. Story 54. Pneumonia. The cough lasted a month, and I ended up getting a secondary infection from it. I wasn't fully better for almost 2 months. Story 55. Hopefully, this isn't triggering. I was a healthy male, 38 years old, with no drinking or smoking habits, going to the gym 5 times a week. I contracted COVID-19 in February 2021 and was bedridden for 2 weeks. I was sleeping 20 hours a day and could barely walk, experiencing shortness of breath, chills, and sweats. It took 4 months for my sense of taste to return. My birthday is in May, and I couldn't even taste my birthday dinner or the cake my mom handmade. I know subsequent variants were less severe, but I was in a bad way during those 2 weeks. Story 56. Umbilical hernia with an obstructed bowel. If that doesn't count, I would say the first time I got strep throat when I was 11 years old made me so weak I could barely stand up. Swallowing anything felt like I was swallowing glass. I had to stay in bed for a week while taking medication. It ruined my perfect attendance streak. I hadn't missed a day of school before that. That was back when I thought school was fun. Story 57. Pneumonia makes you a type of tiredness and weakness you didn't know you could experience while still technically alive. Story 58. My partner and I had the H1N1 virus in 2018, and we both thought we were going to die. I have had COVID-19 twice and suffered from bowel cancer, but I have never been so sick before or after. Story 59. Keratoconus is a condition I have experienced. I have had 4 corneal transplants. The shape of the eyes becomes rugby ball-shaped instead of curved. Story 60. Medically, acute pancreatitis due to gallstones. Psychiatrically, persistent depressive disorder with episodes of severe depression and suicidal thoughts, ongoing for years. Story 61. I am not a doctor, so I am not sure if it counts as an illness, but I had appendicitis when I was 8 years old, and my appendix ruptured during surgery. I experienced extreme pain where my right leg met my hip before and after the surgery, along with multiple fevers exceeding 103 degrees Fahrenheit. I also had several urinary tract infections and nausea that led to vomiting bile. Getting a tube inserted through my nose at 8 years old remains one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. I experienced extreme thirst because I was not allowed to drink water. Although items like milk or juice were permitted, I was forced to drink a red liquid for scans that only made me vomit more. The solid portion of my lower digestive tract refused to function for roughly 10 days. There are probably other things I cannot fully recall due to the trauma. Story 62. I was in rough shape with a respiratory illness in February 2020 that lasted nearly a month. The coughing fits exhausted me, and I nearly choked on my sinus drainage. I had a severe headache at one point that made the world look black and white. I suspect it was COVID-19, but very little was known about that virus at the time. Story 63. I would say dengue fever. It involved a non-stop fever, pain all over, pain behind my eyes, and a strange sensitivity to touch on my skin. I experienced chills for days. This situation occurred before they fully understood how to treat it, so I could only receive intravenous fluids. It was a difficult experience. Story 64. The worst physical illness I have ever had was the stomach flu. I consider myself lucky in that regard. The stomach flu is uncomfortable but not overly painful or life-threatening. I struggle more with mental health than the average person. I manage to appear high-functioning, but no one really knows how much of a mess I actually am. I have severe post-traumatic stress disorder from my childhood. I have been hospitalized in a psychiatric ward 5 times but have been relatively stable for a while. Story 65. Speaking about physical illness, in September I caught a severe virus from my niece that caused me to vomit violently, which led to an unfortunate accident. Additionally, my nose began to bleed. A lot of events occurred that day. Story 66. I had this back in 2002. My platelet count was so low that just about any bleeding could have killed me. I cut myself while shaving the morning I was admitted to the hospital, and it took hours for it to clot. Fortunately, it responded well to treatment. Story 67. Post-traumatic stress disorder, if it counts, and norovirus if it doesn't. I cannot adequately express to you how miserable that experience was, with a toddler and husband who also had it. Second to that was a massive kidney infection that escalated rapidly. I crawled on my hands and knees to my car to see my doctor. I sobbed and begged for my mother. I was 26. Story 68. I had thyroid cancer, which was complicated by a broken wrist during my surgery. However, my primary concern is definitely endometriosis and adenomyosis, which are debilitating and will remain with me forever. I am thankfully cancer-free and hope that no more surgeries are needed for endometriosis or adenomyosis in the foreseeable future. Story 69. Bacterial meningitis, thrombocytopenic purpura, and pulmonary embolism were all equally terrible experiences that nearly cost me my life. Story 70. I was recently diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis, and it is very challenging. I hurt everywhere, and I can't use the thumb on my left hand. My hips and knees are nearly useless in the morning until I take my medication. I am 37 years old and male, which is considered early onset. The fact that I am male and have rheumatoid arthritis is rare. I feel as though I lost the genetic lottery. Story 71. Between COVID and being pregnant, I have been facing several health challenges. Since becoming pregnant, I had a virus that caused a horrible cough for 8 weeks. Now I have influenza A and must miss work for the week due to being contagious. It's especially difficult because there are very few medications that are safe to take while pregnant. Story 72. I have been sick with many things in my life, but the worst one, hands down, is a trophic ulcer. It is rare and very difficult to treat. It appears on the feet and causes a next level of pain. Story 73. I had chickenpox as a child. I have not had any serious illnesses since then, as I am 47 years old. I had COVID-19 a few years ago, but only for a couple of days, and I had the flu a couple of times, usually only lasting 24 to 48 hours. Story 74. I had scarlet fever as a child. It started as strep throat, followed by scarlet fever and a double ear infection. You know, a child is really sick when they aren't even excited to miss school. I also had a severe flu in my 20s, with a fever of 104 degrees. Story 75. Laryngitis. I had it for 2 weeks while living in a cold, poorly ventilated basement apartment. I visited the hospital twice, and both times they told me they could only provide basic treatment and recommended that I wait for it to pass. I know this sounds mild, but to explain it in a few words, it felt like my body was trying to shut down. Sleep was impossible. I was only drifting in and out of consciousness due to intense fatigue, and my appetite was non-existent. Additionally, I experienced severe gastrointestinal issues. On the positive side, I felt rejuvenated afterwards. Story 76. I have had COVID-19 and swine flu. Swine flu was worse. I genuinely thought I might die from it, and I couldn't walk more than about 20 feet without collapsing from breathing problems. I remember leaving my house to try to walk to a store down my road, but I had to stop and sit down against a neighbor's car, wait a few minutes to catch my breath, turn around, and go back home, where I collapsed on the sofa to catch my breath again and sleep there. COVID-19 was bad too, but nowhere near what swine flu did to me. Story 77. Cancer or gallbladder infection. The latter is definitely a close second. It was quicker to deal with, but it hurt a lot more. Story 78. Appendicitis, treated with intravenous antibiotics instead of surgery, made me vomit more times in 48 hours than I ever have in my life. It was also my longest hospital stay, 3 days and 2 nights. I was informed that I have a 40% chance of it recurring, and if it does, surgery will be necessary, no questions asked. Additionally, kidney stones can be quite painful, but at least the pain medication helps. Story 79. I was in basic training and on medication for an allergic reaction. I lost nearly 20 pounds in a week. Story 80. When I was about 2 years old, I had respiratory syncytial virus, a serious respiratory illness, along with a stomach flu. I developed a fever of 105 degrees, had a seizure, and was taken by ambulance to the hospital, where I stayed for weeks. I needed intravenous fluids because I was severely dehydrated. I continue to experience respiratory and digestive problems to this day. Story 81. I experienced food poisoning after eating sushi. I vomited within 30 minutes and was so violent that I almost lost consciousness. Story 82. It's not an illness. However, having a tonsillectomy as an adult was brutal. I have had about 7 surgeries and 2 cesarean sections with no drugs afterward, and I would go through all of them many times before I would consider another tonsillectomy. I was truly shocked, as I have always had a higher pain threshold and figured it would be easy. It turns out it is far more painful to undergo as an adult, especially if your tonsils were as large as mine were. Story 83. Lately, I had a horrendous sore throat in spring 2021. I have experienced severe sore throats since I was a teenager, where I couldn't even swallow. I was 67 when this happened and could not swallow anything. Story 84. I had a streptococcus infection in my left arm. It started as a small bump on my wrist that resembled a mosquito bite, but it progressed to my arm swelling to twice its size, becoming very red and looking dead. It almost appeared as if it was burnt flesh. Initially, they thought it was a flesh-eating disease. Story 85. Not an illness, more of a syndrome, but carpal tunnel syndrome from excess swelling had me waking up screaming, feeling like my arms were being sliced open, with constant numbing and zinging pain shooting down to my wrist and fingers. I have so much more sympathy for those living with carpal tunnel syndrome now. People endure that pain every single day. For me, it lasted about 6 weeks of hell. Story 86. Depression. Physically, it was COVID-19. I felt terrible. I experienced the worst coughs I have ever had, and the body pain was intense. Story 87. Swine flu. There were a few days when I felt lost. It was awful. I was staying with a host family in Peru, and I felt bad that they had to take care of me. I got a bunch of antibiotics from a corner pharmacy, and while they didn't help my viral infection, they seemed to negatively affect my immune system. Story 88. The combination of mononucleosis followed by a severe shingles infection around my right eye caused significant disruption in my life at age 15, resulting in missing most of a school year. My memories from that time involve being bedridden for days, visiting numerous doctors, and returning to school only to experience an overly reactive teacher who sent me to the nurse multiple times for having a dilated pupil. I repeatedly explained that the pupil dilation was caused by the eye medication I was taking for cornea injuries. Story 89. Shingles, followed by a resulting staph infection, is a disease that typically affects the very young and the elderly. It nearly killed me when I was 26. Story 90. I thought my kidney infection was just a weird period, so I dealt with the pain for a couple of days and went to school as normal. Then the fever and chills hit me, and I realized something was really wrong. Patient first prescribed me some medication, which helped for a day before my symptoms worsened. I went straight to the hospital, where I was stuck with 5 IVs because the sites kept closing up and the antibiotics would stop flowing. I immediately developed a fever again, so I had to stay another 24 hours. I ended up being there for 5 days until it was finally over. I had never been hospitalized overnight before, so it was a strange experience. Story 91. Hand, foot, and mouth disease at age 26. I did not know what was happening. First, I experienced an intense fever seemingly out of nowhere that lasted about 24 hours and then disappeared. It was strange but okay, as I felt fine. 2 days later, I noticed a small itchy bump on my thumb, followed by another on my finger, and my throat began to feel strange. More spots appeared. By the end of the day, the spots connected into large itchy red patches. It felt like a combination of poison ivy and hives covering the entirety of my palms, heels, and the back of my throat. It lasted for weeks. There was nothing to do but take antihistamines, which hardly helped, and wait. I could not walk, touch anything, or swallow for days, and it was uncomfortable for weeks. Eventually, it crusted over into scabs, which took even longer to heal. The doctor mentioned that usually babies and kids under 5 get it. Story 92. I got COVID. Thankfully, I had received my vaccinations, and it was later in the pandemic, but it was an awful experience. I couldn't even stand a single lumen of light. The fever and headache were terrible. When the coughing started, I had interrupted sleep. My lungs became badly inflamed, and my nose wouldn't stop clogging. It was 2 weeks of pure misery, and I wouldn't even wish it on my second worst enemy. Story 93. Mental health. Severe depressive disorder. Physical pain. Falling down a staircase as a toddler and hitting my head against a marble surface, causing me to lose a lot of blood quickly. Infection. I experienced some sort of intestinal infection that I still do not understand. It caused me to sleep a lot and left me without energy. I could not eat, drink, or even go to the bathroom. I required intensive care with antibiotics and received nutrition in liquid form through my bloodstream. I experienced a period where my heart stopped and I needed cardiopulmonary resuscitation. I only remember waking up on the floor after being forced to get out of bed to go to the bathroom. Additionally, I nearly died in my crib due to a condition where a baby's body goes completely stiff and unable to move, resulting in death. In our terminology, we loosely translate it as crib death. I remain confused and unable to comprehend how I survived so many near-death experiences. I was lucky many times. Story 94. Chronic fatigue presents various symptoms, with no definitive testing for confirmation and no treatment other than time. I was fortunate to have a well-trained doctor from the UK and a relatively mild case. Undergoing a triple bypass was challenging, but it followed a well-documented path. Story 95. Kidney failure due to stricture disease. I have had stricture disease for about 10 years. It causes the muscles in and around my bladder to halt or restrict the flow of urine out of my body. While on vacation, I felt unwell and was thirsty the entire time, which caused me to urinate frequently. As soon as we returned from vacation, I went to urgent care, where they conducted some blood work and immediately sent me to the emergency room across the street. I was in kidney failure. Despite urinating, the urine had backed up into my kidneys and caused them to shut down. The emergency room staff checked my blood work again, and the reason urgent care sent me right away was that I had almost no red blood cells. I received 2 pints of blood immediately and was hooked up to a catheter to drain everything out. This catheter was inserted directly into my bladder to bypass the blockage. I spent about 6 months using catheters because, after surgery, I needed a different one. The doctors who reviewed this episode couldn't believe I walked in at that condition. Fortunately, I did not need dialysis, as my kidneys started functioning again once the fluid was drained. I am surprised by the number of doctors involved in follow-up care in such a situation. Story 96. A connection exists between having shingles and Lyme disease simultaneously and contracting COVID-19 in 2020, prior to the vaccine. Both experiences were challenging and required a lengthy recovery period. Story 97. I had a severe case of the flu in 2015. There was a period of about 6 weeks, or perhaps even a full 2 months, where I was past the worst of the unpleasant symptoms, and I thought I was ready to return to work. I would drag myself out of bed and go to the office, putting in a full day, only to wake up the next morning feeling exhausted and needing to spend 2 days in bed recovering. My lung capacity has never been the same since. At the time, I didn't think much about it because we were still following the old model of coping with illness by maintaining a stiff upper lip. However, knowing what I know now, I probably should have been hospitalized for at least part of that time and taken a longer leave of absence. Story 98. I don't even remember mine. It was when I was a few months old, around 5, and I got pneumonia. Apparently, it was pretty bad, and we had to cancel a trip that we were in the middle of. The boat we were on had to make an unscheduled stop halfway to the destination to get me to the hospital. Story 99. Probably when I suffered from severe dehydration. In one night, I vomited 45 times from the moment I decided to start counting. I was taken to the emergency room and was admitted for 4 days, receiving fluids through an intravenous line. I initially thought I had food poisoning. Story 100. Ovarian cancer that spread to my bowel. I was very frail after my all-day surgery. I could barely lift my head and couldn't walk for nearly 2 weeks. I had tubes everywhere, including a catheter, a drain, and an ostomy bag. Recovery took several months. I still need support, though, 14 years later. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.